Welcome. Good evening, everyone. Let's try it one more time. Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thank you. I am Dr. Nicole Pendiff, Director of the Northern Leadership Center, usually known as the NLC. We're embedded in the School of Management at the UAF. I want to thank everyone for coming out tonight in this deep freeze. We promise that it will be worth all the extra layers you had to put on to get here. So before I introduce the speaker tonight, I would like to thank Dr. Nancy Wagner and Wayland Baptist University for all their hard work and support for this event. So Nancy, if you could go ahead and stand. I'd like everybody to give her a little applause. We couldn't have done it without you. Program. I'd also like to, at this time, acknowledge Hope Bickmeyer. Hope, you can stand as well, please. She is currently our NLC program coordinator, whose hard work has been evident in every program we have facilitated this year. And I want to thank her for this wonderful year that we've had. She is going to be moving on to bigger and better things at the end of this week. So I hope that you have been truly amazing, and I wish you the best in your Now it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dale Nienow, the Executive Director of the Center for Ethical Leadership. He is here as a Susan Herman Distinguished Speaker. This series was established at the Northern Leadership Center after Professor Herman passed away in 2009. At UAF and in the Fairbanks community, Susan touched many lives. She was the founder of the Northern Leadership Center and designer of the UAF Summer Leadership Institute, among many other outstanding programs. The list is actually too long to go on about. This speaker series honors her legacy by bringing in experts in leadership to strengthen our community in terms of leadership development. Dr. Nienow is known for creating gracious spaces where people can work across boundaries to form collective leadership and for helping people open up to deeper dialogue and new relationships that will move groups and communities forward on their compelling issues. Dale has a PhD in education from the University of Southern California, a master's degree in administration from Pacific Lutheran University, a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Olaf College. Dale has co-led the National Kellogg Leadership for Community Change program on behalf of the Kellogg Foundation and is one of the founders of the National Community Learning Exchange. He is co-editor of the Collective Leadership Storybook, Weaving Strong Communities, and the monograph, Kellogg Leadership for Community Change, Crossing Boundaries, Strengthening Communities, and is one of the primary authors of the book, Courageous Collaboration with Gracious Space, From Small Openings to Profound Transformations. He will have books for sale and have a signing directly after this presentation, so we hope you will stay for that. Please join me in a very warm Fairbanks welcome to Dr. Dale Nienow.
Wow, it's nice to be here. I'm not often welcomed by 40 degrees below zero, so this is a first for me. I'm really delighted to spend the evening with you. And what I'm hoping to do is to do a little setup, share some stories about the kind of leadership that I've learned about, and then have some questions, make sure we're clear on some of the concepts, but then really get into some conversation about your own community. I spend a lot of time traveling to places to engage them in conversations about leadership. I think I've worked in most of the states. I've had people from 55 countries come to the center to engage, so I've had conversations in Arabic and Urdu and Pashto and all these. And I don't speak all these languages, but it's always interesting to see what translates. At the Center for Ethical Leadership, we always like to start in a good way. So what I'd like to ask you to do is take a minute or two and have a brief conversation with two other people. You know, what I'd like you to do is introduce yourself, and whether you're new to Fairbanks or not, you know, you can do that. But then, what's one thing you love about this community, about Alaska? So we're telling the probably 30-second version of that, because I imagine some of you could take a whole day and talk about it. So just quickly connect. If you want to stand and just turn to two other people and have this conversation. But let's warm up the room with your stories real quick. So meet two other people really quickly. So did everyone have a chance to do an introduction? Great. Thank you. Thank you. It's really nice to hear your voices. I love that. So I also want to start by sharing a poem. It's a poem of reflection because it says a lot about the way I think we need to work with each other when we're in community. It's called Oh the Joy. It was written by a woman in the middle 1800s, back when they had such things as processing wheat. So this can give you a little context. Oh the joy, the inexpressible comfort of feeling safe with another, having neither weighed thoughts nor measured words, pouring them all out just as they are, chaff and grain together, trusting that a loving hand will sift through, keep what is worth keeping, and with a breath of kindness blow the rest away. So I always invite people to act that way with each other, and if what I say is chaff to you, let it blow away gently. If it's grain, you can take it in and let it nourish you, and either way I'm fine with that. So the center that I operate has been around for 20 years, and we've been asking the same question for 20 years. What kind of leadership does a common good need at this time in this place? So you can imagine that changes where I go and at different times. So I want to ask you tonight, and we're going to play with this a little bit, is what kind of leadership does a common good need in Fairbanks at this particular moment in time? So we're going to spend more time playing with that. I want to share a little bit of the observation from these travels around the country and just from the things that I read, and you may have some, because I think if we're going to talk about understanding the times we're in, it helps to have both a national and local perspective. So from the national perspective, here are some of the things I see. Our country's biggest businesses have made record profits the last few years, and yet we have record unemployment. So we're entering kind of a new thing. We don't need as many people to make a lot of money. The large institutions that created some of the crisis that we have been in got bailed out. They seem to have recovered, but a lot of the rest of us haven't yet. A lot of our governments, local, state, and federal, haven't recovered yet. In my home state of Washington, where I'm living now, I guess it's home after being there for 20-some years, 25% of the people who went to food banks last year owned their own homes. Kind of a nutty concept. So if you probe beneath that, what that means is their mortgages are underwater. They've exhausted their retirement funds. They don't have work. They still have their name on this piece of property, and they're showing up at food banks. So middle-class folks who are newly poor. Very strange concept. The healthcare system is not able to handle all of the people in the community. Public schools have a hard time handling all the people in the community, particularly people of color, immigrants, and those who are living in poverty. Higher education is increasingly unaffordable, and students are leaving with greater debt and more limited job prospects. And though we're a nation of immigrants, we can't quite figure out our relationship to immigrants, where we stand with that. So all of this is leading to a big national time of uncertainty. And just when we need the most creative and courageous leadership, we're pretty much getting deadlock. We have people who are representing us who, instead of being bold and principled and compassionate, are fairly rigid, fairly intolerant, and pretty much looking for dominance of each other. And that divisiveness has rippled down. I don't know how it is in this community, but it's rippled down in lots of states where neighbors have a hard time talking to neighbors about anything that's meaningful. And you would think with neighbors, that's where we need to talk about the most meaningful things. So what's happening nationally is we mostly gather with people who think like us. That's not a great formula for fixing things. But I want to report to you that I'm bringing hope, not just gloom and doom, because I've been with lots of different communities. I've been fortunate to travel to many states the last few years, in a lot of communities that would not be considered mainstream. They're below the radar. Here's some of the kinds of communities. I've been in rural communities that might have 200 people living in them in northern Wisconsin, sharing a school district, maybe 400 square miles in a school district. I've been in the border communities of the very southern tip of Texas, all Mexican-American immigrants. I've worked with communities of color and immigrant communities in Buffalo, New York, Minneapolis, and Denver, and Seattle, all over the place. I worked with indigenous communities, native communities in Montana, in Mexico, Minnesota, indigenous Hawaiians, just got back from working with them. So lots of very different, and I've worked in rural Appalachia, in coal mining country. So you get a sense of some of the stories I'm going to share from these communities. What's interesting about these communities is from the outside, they look like they're really hurting, and they are in many ways. They're seen as having a lot of poverty, health and educational inequities, low employment, poor wages. But from inside, the folks that I've been working with look very different. Rather than being stuck in despair, they're coming together to claim what gifts they have and work together in some new ways and collectively start making some changes in their circumstances. Much of this work has been funded, as the introduction said, from the Kellogg Foundation. And a lot of the issues that we focused on were educational equity. So some of the examples are around education, but they could be on any issue because it's really how people come together and work. So let me give you a story. This very southern tip of Texas, there's a small community about 8 miles from the border. It's named Ed Couch Elsa. Very small community. Nick, have you been to Ed Couch? Okay.
I grew up in Hanford.
You did?
Border of Ed Couch.
Cool. Do you know Llano Grande Center?
What's that?
Do you know the Llano Grande Center?
No.
Okay, well, we will have to go on a trip to your neighborhood. So I've been working with folks there for 10 years, and they've been at this longer than I've worked with them. So statistically, a very poor region. Feel free to jump in if I'm not getting the story right. The economy's been built on low-wage labor, so people who are more in the management class are doing pretty well, and the people who are working for them are pretty much in very low-wage jobs and stuck in this cycle where their kids are in low-wage jobs. There's kind of low educational achievement, and the cycle had been like that for a long time until this particular organization we work with stepped in. They were working in high school, and they noticed that 70% of the Mexican American kids did not go on to college, and many did not graduate. Before graduation, they got involved in migrant labor. They worked with their families to help make ends meet. So tremendous disuse of the educational system. Just wasn't working. So these teachers started wondering about that, and a couple of brothers got together, Francisco and Miguel Guajardo, and they started bringing some of their colleagues together to see what sense they could make in this. And they realized that both the aspiration levels and the expectation levels for Mexican Americans around education were not very high. Just a little bit of probing, they discovered that in the curriculum, there were 0 stories that represented Mexican Americans in any way. So curriculum, they didn't feel like they belonged. They didn't feel like education was there. So the teachers decided they were going to do something about the Guajardo brothers. And they discovered oral history from a poor community in Appalachia, and they engaged their students in going out and collecting oral stories in the community. So they would interview elders in the community. And over a couple of years, they accumulated 400 stories. So from 0 to 400. So here's an example of a story. There's an elder who's in his 90s, and he comes in and they start asking him questions. And he says, well, I am the founder of this community. And the students are kind of scratching their heads and saying, you dug ditches for your life. You're the founder of the community? What do you mean by that? He said, the water supply that you get to enjoy? The irrigation system that feeds our citrus empire that supports all of our jobs? Who do you think dug those ditches? Who designed that water supply? I did that. So I am the founder of this community. And they're going, he's right. He's right. He's not making stuff up. But something switches. People, the students doing the interviews are gaining incredible skills gathering these stories. But more than that, they start seeing the strengths of their community. They start seeing their stories in a different way and believe in themselves more. The community is asked the stories. They start believing in the students and the schools and the teachers more. So you start seeing something build from the storytelling. So the story had been for a long time that this community was poor, but they started changing the story to we're not poor, we're rich in culture and history and resilience and all this resource, the wealth of our people. So the teachers started raising the expectations, and then they said, our kids ought to be able to go to any college in the country. So they started taking them on college trips. And before they knew it, they had about 50 kids in the Ivy League schools. From this tiny little town, they were going to MIT, they were going to Yale and Harvard, and succeeding. And then instead of jetting off, as some did, a lot of them came back to the community, and they became assistant city managers, and newspaper editors, and engineers. And instead of only having a life that was the labor of their hands, which they respected in their elders, they added to that they could have a life based on the creativity of their minds, all the different gifts that they have. So that's one example of the kind of communities that I'm working with. And I want to pull out a few learnings from this, because it's really the premise of what I want to share with you. The community, there are lots of communities around the country, like Encounter said, that are redefining leadership, and they're reclaiming leadership. And we often think of leaders as people in positions of power, and that's an important part of leadership. And I admire anyone who takes on a position of leadership and power. But it's not sufficient because it leaves a lot of the rest of us out. So there's a new definition of leadership that's emerging from these communities, and we have come to call it collective leadership. In some ways, it's very ancient, but it's also new as well. So it's got two parts to the definition. The first part is anyone can be a leader when they're ready to share their gifts in service of the community. Didn't talk about getting elected, didn't talk about getting hired. Whenever you're ready to share your gifts in service of the community and you get together with someone else who wants to do that, you are a leader. And they claim that. The second part is this collective leadership notion. And what they meant by that is it's a diverse group of people who come together and cooperatively partner to advance their community in some way. So instead of one leader telling other people what to do, the collective of people hold the direction, the planning, the action, and all of the work. And deciding what to do comes from the collective wisdom of the group. So it's a very different notion of leadership. What I want to share with you is just three quick things about the characteristics of that, so you get a little bit of an understanding of that. So you with me so far? Makes sense? Okay, great. So the first one I've already hinted at is this idea that communities are countering the narrative that's handed to them. So somebody tells you you're poor, and you say, well, in one way we are, but we're really not. So they're because what happens is outsiders often see the deficits, and will come in. I'll give you another example. One of the communities I work with is Benton Harbor, Michigan. Anybody ever been there? Okay. It's a small predominantly African American community, right next to a small, predominantly white community, separated by a river. And a few years back, I don't know exactly when, it might have been 10 or so, a police officer stopped a young person. They got into an altercation. The police officer shot the young person. So other young people in the community were very upset with the excessive use of force, which that's what they interpreted at that point in time. And they got together and they set a vacant house on fire. The news media rushed in and labeled the riots of Benton Harbor. We came in about 5 years after this, and what people in the community told us is essentially what the media did is they showed the same burning house from 5 different angles and made it look like the whole town was burning. So from the outside, the community got to be portrayed, the youth in particular, as violent lawbreakers. What happened after the riots is the adults in the community said, this makes no sense to have this kind of divide. And so they brought as many adults together as they could, and they formed a Boys and Girls Club. And as they formed the Boys and Girls Club, they started partnering, particularly with the high school students, and had them help form this club. And as they engaged the young people in the effort, they learned to take responsibility and to engage the community. So it wasn't just about serving the young people and having them have a good experience. They also taught them how to come engage and give back in the community. So when I was working with them, I went to some meetings, and here were the kinds of things the young people were suggesting, that these violent, out-of-control lawbreakers. So here's what I'm seeing. They worked with adults to increase the high school graduation rate, which was at about 60%. And in the group of people that we worked with, it quickly went to 100%. They increased the college-going rate. And they launched their own tutoring programs. They launched a program to educate parents on college admission so they could get kids through the application process and the financial aid and all that, and help them. And they had conversations with teachers where they were asking the teachers, please raise your expectations of us. So the inside story and the outside story are very different realities, and that's this first part of collective leadership is whatever story you've been sold, there may be some truth to it, but you don't have to buy it as the outcome. Create your own story. So the Benton Harbor story changed from our youth are violent and nothing good comes out of Benton Harbor to our youth can succeed in anything and are valued partners in the community. So very different. So the second part of this collective leadership story is that people work across boundaries to create trusting relationships. Think of all the boundaries that exist in community. Any community that you go in, there are a ton of boundaries that create very separate kind of lives. We can live these parallel lives. So I see things a lot of times by class, or economic status, certainly a lot by race. Educational level is a big divide. Age, huge divide. Religion, whether you have institutional power or not. But you can picture any kind of boundary. I always think of boundaries as holding great energy that's sometimes misapplied. Sometimes we need boundaries just to protect ourselves to be safe. So I'm not encouraging anybody to give up safety boundaries. But we get locked into a lot of other kind of boundaries that use our energy. If you're holding an old wound or an old hurt, you're holding onto it. It takes a lot of energy to hold on to that. So you're expending a lot of energy. So some of the communities that I work with have really intentionally stepped across some boundaries. So I'm going to share another story. In New Mexico, just west of Albuquerque, there are two Hispanic communities, Cubero and Sabieta, and two Indian Pueblo communities, Acoma and Laguna. Anybody been to those communities? Okay, you've been traveling pretty much so far. We have to have a road trip here. So the setup here is the conquest by Europeans of North America started a couple hundred years earlier in the New Mexico area than even in Montana. So in 1598, the conquistadors, the Spanish folks, came up the Rio Grande from Mexico, and it runs right through Albuquerque. And they came up and they essentially colonized the Pueblo folks. So for 400 years, they've been living side by side in this really uneasy tension. The descendants of the conquistadors and the descendants of the Pueblo Indians. They share a public school in Grants County, and the Grants County and the part that they share is a really poor part of the county that's not given a lot of resources. They decided that these four communities were going to collaborate together to build a new school because they said they had crappy facilities, they didn't have good enough support for education. So they started collaborating, and they were able to persuade their community to vote for a bond and to get the school district to fund a new school. And in that new school, they have 4 towers, and each of the towers has symbols of their particular culture. But sometimes what happens in a community that's been left behind for a long time, you build a new school, and people stand a little taller. You feel a little bit more respected. So this group, in addition to building a high school, are now working on building a first-class curriculum that will match the quality of high school. But here's the quote from one of the meetings with this unprecedented collaboration. For 400 years, Pueblo Indians and Hispanic descendants have been living side by side, and we now realize we need each other to have a good future for our kids. Quite a quote. Quite a quote. So working across boundaries is really important. I collect stories now on working across boundaries, all the different places people live. So here's just a few quick ones. In Seattle, government and business environmental groups have banded together over the last 20 years, and they have protected all of the watershed, all of the water supply that's coming into Seattle now. It's all free from any kind of contamination or development. We protected it into the future. It took a lot of work, so they work together. I've read about groups that are pro-choice and pro-life who are getting together around reducing the number of abortions. Not convincing each other, but let's just reduce the number of abortions. Gay rights leaders and Christian leaders have collaborated to tone down the rhetoric in high school so that both gay youth and Christian youth feel safe there. Nobody feels picked on. So again, not trying to convince each other. So this energy that's locked up in boundaries is a big deal. And one of the biggest boundaries I see across the United States is around political views today. It shows up with this unwillingness to be with people who think differently than us. So I just want you to picture for a moment, you know, those moments when you have been triggered by a political comment, and all of a sudden you're feeling this rush of righteousness. You know, we've all had that experience. So what happens in your body? You know, you hear a trigger word, you hear some comment, and all of a sudden you're going, man, these people are just crazy. I can't believe they said that. And you're ready to pounce on them. The next thing they say, you just want to take them out. No matter who, it might be your pastor, it might be your spouse, it might be, but and then the question I have is, what kind of openness, what kind of space is left in you to collaborate? What kind of space is left in you to open up to learning something new? You know, we shut it all up. So this is happening all over the place, and I have it happen. You know, I'm not preaching to you. I'm admitting to you this is what goes on in me too. It's just a waste of energy because it just shuts us down. So last year we did something a little different in Seattle around this, just to prove that we could do something. We had a series of dialogues with people across faith and across political parties, and it culminated in a day-long gathering with 100 people from the Tea Party, libertarians, conservatives, progressive, liberals. Very interesting. And the question we formed around was, what would a free and fair economy look like in Washington State? So we set it up, and we taught people some techniques for getting, but nobody killed anybody. Nobody walked out. Nobody yelled at anybody. And we really had quite a marvelous day. And I had a very progressive friend come up to me at lunch, and he said, "You were just making me crazy. I don't understand this day at all. I just sat down with somebody who is a stereotype of everything I'm against. They were carrying a loaded gun, strapped to their hip. And as we got in conversation, we agreed on a lot of things. I don't know what sense to make of it." So one of the reasons we spend so much time at the community level rather than trying to change DC is when you all sit down, no matter how different your views are, and you actually take the time and you set up the space to be this kind of the joy kind of space, you can't settle for your stereotypes of each other anymore. The stories don't allow you to. They're too narrow, they're too simplistic. So at the community level, we have incredible power to change relationships, to change the dynamics. We don't have to buy it. Okay, so the last element I want to share with you is that collective leadership is really about tapping into the wisdom from very diverse sources in the community, particularly those people who normally aren't asked for their opinion, normally are not asked, those who are marginalized, left out. So give you another story there. There was a community that wanted to transform the criminal justice system because this particular community saw that anytime someone broke the law, they were treated very harshly, they were incarcerated, and once the offenders engaged the criminal system, they pretty much were locked in. They just kept coming back, and it didn't heal the community. It didn't do anything for that person. We wasted all this human talent. So they brought together people to try to figure out this system. And here's an example of what they did. They started changing how they did sentencing and how they talked about restoration. In this particular case, when considering a punishment that was appropriate for a man who stole something, they asked community members to share their perspective. So one of the community members was his wife. And here's what she said. She said, "If you want to punish my husband, put me in jail. Because if you put him in jail, he's going to get 3 meals a day, he's going to get to exercise, he's not going to have to worry about his housing. If you put me in jail, he's got to feed the kids, get them to school, get a job, pay the rent, pay the bills, and then come and visit me once in a while. But That's kind of a crazy perspective, isn't it? But there's a lot of brilliance to that. Now, they didn't put her in jail, but it opened up a different kind of conversation. So I just use that as an illustration to say there's wisdom in all of us with our life perspectives that we don't tap because a lot of times our systems don't ask. So these are some of the characteristics that I'm seeing around in communities. So what does it take to do this collective kind of leadership? To build these new narratives, to cross boundaries, to tap into voices. So I just want to mention a couple things real quickly. One thing is that we need to create space where we can come together that's of a different kind. A kind of space where we will come with our best stuff, our most openness, not with our righteousness, not with our rigid judgments of others. So we need to learn how to create a different kind of space. And we need organizations that can bring us together and who will bring us together regularly. So the University of Arizona Fairbanks Northern Leadership Center, Wayland Baptist University, the Chamber of Commerce today, this Susan Herman, is it Susan Herman? Susan Herman speaker series. Bring people together regularly, change the space. And then the last part of that is to be willing to change yourself. Be willing to change yourself. Instead of, it's the notion of judging less, listening more, and opening up. Just picture that: judging less, listening more, opening up. I'm doing this energy because it's instead of like this or like this. It's just a different. It's a very different kind of energy. And instead of trying to fix other people, just learn and open up and fix the things in yourself that close you down. So one other story about opening up, because I've seen so many examples of people opening up in just remarkable ways. Met a woman in Montana, the Salish Kootenai tribe. Her name was Francine. And I don't know if you know much about tribal communities, but the tribal community and the white community shared a public school. And it was two different schools, very different realities, very different experiences, often didn't come to the same events. And a group of people in that community decided they wanted to change the educational experience for all their kids. The dropout rates were terrible for all kids, particularly for Native Americans. And they realized if they were going to do that, they needed a cross-race group. So they got a cross-race group together, and they started working in the community. And the community built up a pretty good sense of openness for working on issues and ideas. And then they went to the school and tried to work with the school board. Well, the school board was all white. They were all very conservative. And the school board chair basically said, what kind of nonsense is this? We're going to work on this stuff over my dead body. And that's what he told them. So Francine has lived with a whole lifetime of discrimination being Native American. And a lot of times, she had every justification in the world to go off and say, man, that guy is crazy, and I'm not working with him. Instead, what she did is she and a small group of people started inviting him for coffee. They just kept inviting, and then they started sharing stories. And after a few months of this, they said, they started opening up more conversation. And after a year, he was ready to be in the conversation. He ended up bringing a proposal for some special programs that would change the climate in the school to the rest of the board, and it passed unanimously. So going from the righteousness of rejecting someone because they say over my dead body to having them be your chief ally, that takes a lot of openness. So what I'm suggesting is that Francine can do it after a lifetime of marginalization. Certainly we can overcome some of the barriers that happen in our community. So that's the end of the setup. And what I'd like to ask is what kind of leadership do you need at this time to advance the common good in Fairbanks? What's the new community narrative that you want to create? What boundaries will you cross to open up new possibilities? What voices do you need to engage? What are the issues that matter to you most? I think I will stop there and get into some conversation. So here's what I propose. These chairs are movable, and what I would do is I would create some small circles of 4, no more than 5 people, where you're sitting in a small circle, knee to knee. And then let's have some conversation about the leadership that you need in your particular community. So maybe you can start with, what of this collective leadership that I've shared, what aspects of this could you use more of in your community? And around what issues? So let's just start there, and then we'll kind of go between small group and large group for a little bit and see what you have. Does that make sense? Is that clear enough? So you don't have to over-organize yourself. Just get 4 or 5 people together in a circle, and let's take probably about 15 minutes to kind of work this one, and then we'll talk a little bit more as a large group.